Hello everyone. If you're joining us on TikTok, on YouTube, we are here for an Ask Me Anything election edition. We're live right now. My name is Ashley Fraser. I'm the TikTok producer for CBC News, and I'm joined live right now over in Ottawa. We have Catherine Cullen. She is our parliamentary senior reporter. She is also the host of the podcast and radio show The House, which is helping us make sense of all that's happening Canadian politics-wise. So Catherine, hello. How's it going?
Hey, Ashley. You know what? It's going well. It's going, though, a little bit chaotic. Donald Trump sort of shaking things up once again in the middle of this election campaign, but I would say that's kind of proving to be par for the course.
Fair enough, fair enough. So let's just start off with a little bit about you. You know, right now you're hosting actually a special election edition of your podcast, House Party. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's something really fun we're doing. It's sort of a little election like pop-up podcast we've created. It drops every Wednesday, and it's something I do with a couple of political friends of mine. Now I'll get a little bit politically nerdy together. Danielle Thibault from Radio Canada and Jason Markusoff, who writes for the CBC based out of Calgary. And we just try to each week, every Wednesday, the episode drops, we talk about one big burning election question. So this week we decided what we wanted to talk about was the question of whether or not this election is it bringing Canadians together or is it pulling the country apart? The discussion out of Alberta has been really interesting. Former Reform Party leader Preston Manning has suggested that if Mark Carney is re-elected, it could fuel a Western secession movement, right? That he could be the last prime minister of a united Canada. So we talked a bit about some of those dynamics in Alberta, but it's interesting, at the same time, the Bloc Québécois, the party that is on the forefront of the sovereignty movement, at least in terms of the House of Commons, they're really not having a lot of traction based on public opinion polls. So looking at whether or not sentiments are flaring in Alberta, whether or not they're dampening in Quebec, and talking about how we could possibly do a bit of a better job on the national unity front. So it was a really fun episode. If anybody's interested, you can find it anywhere you get your podcasts.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that. And, you know, we're taking all of your questions right now on TikTok, on YouTube. If you want to put them in the chat box, you can. You can also email us at ask@cbc.ca, and we're going to take some of those questions right now. So, Catherine, yeah, you mentioned the news of the day, tariffs, already. So we've already got some questions. We've got lots of emails about that for the last few weeks. So what is the latest that we are hearing about the tariffs?
It is changing like by the minute, Ashley. It's pretty crazy. So Donald Trump put out this post on Truth Social, less than 2 hours ago, in which he said, okay, these reciprocal tariffs that I've hit most of the world with, and you'll remember that's when he had that great big billboard out in the Rose Garden, and there were, every country you could think of and some you would never name, right? Those uninhabited islands off the coast of Australia where only penguins lived, getting hit with 10% tariffs. Now he has come out and said, well, guess what? I'm going even harder on China, but I'm pulling back the tariffs on everyone else. The wrinkle for Canada here is that the initial information we were getting, and our reporters in Washington, D.C. were getting from the White House, was that while Canada had been spared last week in the Rose Garden by specifically the reciprocal tariffs, and I get it, you need a flow chart to keep track of what's happening right now, that in fact the significance of this announcement was that we were going to get hit with 10% tariffs along with Mexico. Now, the latest information we are getting is that perhaps that most recent information from the White House might not have been accurate. And so it is confusing. It is a head scratcher. I will say, Ashley, it is symptomatic of the moment that we are living in. All throughout this process with Trump 2.0, anything to do with tariffs, Canadian officials haven't had a heads up of what's coming, right? They have learned about this, leaning into their TV screens, trying to determine what was on that great big billboard in the Rose Garden. And so often we see moments where officials, even within the Trump administration, are contradicting one another in terms of what is happening. Some of that chaos is, I think, part of how Trump likes to operate. He knows that uncertainty can sometimes help him get his way, I suppose. But it's a very confusing moment right at this second for Canada to figure out whether or not we have just been slapped with yet another round of tariffs or not.
Yeah, most definitely. And we're already getting some questions about that. But actually, someone has just asked, Jared on YouTube, he is asking, what are the biggest issues facing Canada that aren't Donald Trump?
Well, if you look at public opinion polling, certainly what Canadians would tell you is that it is cost of living and affordability issues. And it's interesting because this sort of sets up the central premise that Canadians are going to have the chance to weigh in on in this election, right? On the one hand, you have the Liberals who are really leaning in on a ballot question, which is who is best set to deal with Donald Trump. And you have the Conservatives who would rather that this election be fought on a question of affordability and whether or not this is a time for a change. So Jared's question was, well, what are we talking about that isn't Trump? Certainly, people are still worried about, affordability, the price of groceries. It's interesting, healthcare is a recurring issue in federal elections. It's provincial jurisdiction, but it's still something that the federal government plays a role in. It's something that comes up time and time again. I was speaking to one candidate who said in his province, this was something he heard about nonstop in the last election. Not a single person has asked him about it as he goes door knocking, trying to get people's votes. So I think that does speak to the extent to which Canadians are, by and large, focused on this, but we shouldn't say to the exclusion of all other issues. Mr. Poilievre was out today talking about his pitch to deal with crime and justice issues, and Liberal leader Mark Carney has said that he will be talking about that. I might be mistaken, but perhaps as soon as tomorrow. The NDP out talking about pharmacare expansion. So certainly there are other issues on the table, and we're waiting to see the party's platforms, which will give people a sense of where they stand on a wide swath of issues, well beyond Canada's relationship with the U.S. and Canada's relationship with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people are wondering where they can look at those party platforms as we're getting them, you can go to cbc.ca/party platforms, and that's where you can find out a bit more about how all the parties stack up with their policies. And again, we are taking your questions on TikTok, on YouTube. You can also email us at ask@cbc.ca, and we'll answer them right now with our senior reporter, Catherine Cullen. She's in Ottawa. So Roshan on YouTube has asked, do you have any idea about Mark Carney's immigration policy?
He has, so this is the whole story of immigration policy in Canada in the last little while is an interesting one because, of course, the Liberals under Justin Trudeau were really bullish on immigration. They kept saying higher and higher targets for the number of permanent residents that they were going to bring into the country. And then in the last couple of years, they had to take a little bit of a step back. Certainly Pierre Poilievre had been quite critical on that question, but above and beyond the political pressure, I think a lot of it had to do with these questions around housing in particular. And so towards the end of Justin Trudeau's time as Prime Minister, the Liberals said, listen, we're pulling back a bit on our targets for permanent immigration. We're setting targets for non-permanent immigration. So then you're talking about things like temporary foreign workers, folks who come in to do specific jobs in Canada, but they aren't promised citizenship, that they'll stay here for the long haul, and things like international students. That's been in the news a lot. Pierre Poilievre has said that he would tie his immigration plans to both the housing starts and the number of healthcare workers and whatnot. Mark Carney has also indicated that he has more, I suppose we could say, muted ambitions when it comes to immigration. He's talked about the fact that Canada has not lived up to its obligation to people who come to this country in terms of being able to provide them with everything that they need. I don't think that we have anything specific as immigration levels from the Liberals yet, but we do get the sense that he is existing in the same sort of political territory as Justin Trudeau towards the end of his time as Prime Minister, and perhaps Pierre Poilievre. The specifics, of course, will be important. And again, those costed platforms that we expect to see from all the major parties, I think likely before those debates, about 10 days before Canadians vote, that will be an important thing to keep an eye out for.
Definitely. And we're definitely getting a lot of questions about when all these things are going to come out. So that's a very good point there. Someone from TikTok, Leo, he's asking, how much is Trump impacting Canada and what areas is he impacting the most?
Well, I mean, I suspect, Ashley, that question means economically. I mean, certainly the areas being hit with tariffs would be the most significant ones, right? So let's try to remind ourselves of what's happened here. And I will say that in the studio we have monitors up there. I can see Donald Trump is talking right now. I'm keeping an eye on my email. If there is a big takeaway in terms of what's happening with tariffs, I'll try to incorporate that into the conversation. But writ large, first, we had Donald Trump hitting Canada with 25% tariffs, 10% tariffs on energy because of these purported concerns about the border, right? Folks will remember that Donald Trump said there was too much fentanyl getting into the United States from Canada. There were too many people crossing the border illegally. And in order to hit back at both Canada and Mexico, he was going to put in place these 25% tariffs on most goods, 10% on energy. Then he backpedaled. And suddenly we found ourselves in a situation where really it was only goods that were not compliant with the new NAFTA, CUSMA, the trade deal that Donald Trump renegotiated the last time he was president. So by and large, what we're told is that excludes a lot of goods, even things that wouldn't sort of have ticked that box before, that businesses were going to find a way to make sure they could tick that box to avoid these significant tariffs. So that's one moment. Then you get to steel and aluminum tariffs, those industries being hit, and they are significant industries, particularly in Ontario and Quebec. And then auto tariffs as well. And auto is a big deal for Canada because it is, I believe, our second largest export after energy to the United States as a sector. Something that people feel really acutely in southwestern Ontario. It's not just the cars themselves, it's the parts manufacturers. We hear so much about how things go back and forth across the border. Above and beyond all those actual tariffs, it's also the fact that of where we started, Ashley, right, which is this chaos, this economic uncertainty. It is making, if you're a Canadian business, and you're trying to make a decision right now, right? Like, you don't know what's going to happen next. So you may not be making decisions to invest or grow your business. If you're a business that's thinking about, you're a business from overseas, or you're American, you're thinking about investing in Canada, you don't know how hard Donald Trump's going to make that for you. Maybe you're just going to build your next factory in the United States, which is Donald Trump's express goal here, because you think it's going to save you a lot of headache. So there's the uncertainty created, there's the possibility that we are going to find ourselves in a recession, the United States, the world, because of these reciprocal tariffs. That's what everybody was talking about until this 90-day pause, which we are now trying to make sense of. Like, long story short, this is huge. And there are potentially a lot of jobs on the line, and just the economic well-being of this country. Precisely how big the damage is going to be is something we're still trying to sort out day to day, moment to moment.
Yeah, and on that news of the 90-day pause, Russell Wave on YouTube, he's asking, or they are asking, do you think that the 90-day pause is going to get some people's mind off of Trump? And if so, does that benefit the Conservatives?
Well, I think it's a great question. It's a smart question. I think that will depend on what happens to Canada in all of this, which we're waiting to find out right now. It's true that if we're talking less about Trump, that is territory that the Conservatives would rather be in. And I don't want to make this sound like it's this absolute sort of on-off switch. Of course, the Conservatives have plenty of policy to deal with the United States. The Liberals have plenty of policy that addresses cost of living issues and issues outside of Donald Trump. But the sense we get is that the Liberals benefit more when the conversation is about Donald Trump. You know, Mark Carney likes to say, I'm not a politician. It's interesting. He seems most comfortable when he gets to put his prime minister hat back on, even though he was only prime minister for 9 days. When he gets to put his prime minister hat back on and say he's having these conversations with other world leaders, he just sort of seems more comfortable in that environment. The Conservatives, you know, Pierre Poilievre was back today talking about crime, stop the crime, right? They had that slogan, axe the tax, stop the crime, fix the budget, build the homes. This was the thing that was going to carry them to the promised land of a majority government for months and months. And Donald Trump has really gotten in the way of that, it appears. Although I'll just add one other thing, which is that a Conservative was pointing out to me just today that the last federal election campaign, when Erin O'Toole was running for the Conservatives, today's the midway point. At this point, the Conservatives thought they were going to win. Their own polling was showing that they were 5 or 6 points ahead of the Liberals. They were feeling really good about things. So it is a reminder that things can change. I mean, goodness knows they have in the last few months in Canadian politics. The roller coaster ride isn't over. It's just a question of what Canadians are going to decide about what puts us on the best footing going forward.
Absolutely. And we're getting some questions a little bit more about some party platforms here. So MKD on TikTok has asked us, what is Carney's plan on crime?
Well, I'll be honest to say that we do not know a lot about that. As I said, Mr. Carney was asked today about some of the constitutional issues, and sort of more broadly, what does he think of Pierre Poilievre's new pitch, this 3 strikes and you're out for dangerous offenders, that you would, face a more serious sentence. You wouldn't be able to get out on house arrest or whatnot. There are questions about the extent to which that would be constitutional. Mr. Poilievre has said he would be willing to use the notwithstanding clause in order to do what he thinks is right for the justice system here in this country. Mr. Carney dismissed that. He said, baseball analogies are not the right way to be talking about issues that are this serious, but specifically what he would do about crime in communities and addressing issues about the justice system. We don't know the answers yet, but we expect to hear something relatively soon.
Yeah, most definitely. And if you do want more information about party platforms and how they stack up against each other, you can head to cbc.ca/party platforms, where we're updating that constantly as we get more information about where the parties stand on all sorts of issues. So you can find out a bit more information there. And we are still taking your questions on TikTok, on YouTube. And if you want to email us, ask@cbc.ca. We are also monitoring that email constantly. We have another user on YouTube who is asking about another party platform. Do you have any information about Pierre Poilievre's environmental policies?
This is a super interesting question. So again, we don't have the full platforms out, but I interviewed Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer on the program that I host, The House, a few weeks back, and this is something we talked a lot about, specifically what the Conservatives think about trying to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that the Conservatives wanted to axe the consumer carbon tax. Mark Carney beat them to the punch. The Conservatives say, though, the only way to make that permanent, their argument is to put them in power, because they say Mr. Carney has been a proponent of the consumer carbon tax in the past. That's true. Mr. Carney says, listen, it's too divisive now. That's not the route we're going on. But the Conservatives say, you really want this? We're the ones you have to vote for. The Conservatives have said they want to cut the federal backstop on industrial carbon pricing. So basically, the rule where the federal government says, okay, industry, this is what we want you to do to try to keep your emissions in check. This is a pretty big deal, because that industrial price on carbon, according to estimates from independent climate organizations, it accounts for a big chunk of how Canada plans to bring down its greenhouse gas emissions. And so when I was talking to Andrew Scheer about this particular policy, an argument he makes, and you hear this a lot in Conservative circles, is why not expand Canadian energy, right? Why not more pipelines? Why not more Canadian oil to the world if it is displacing things like dirty coal in China or other parts of the world, that ultimately this will drive down global emissions? They say a carbon emission doesn't care whether it's created in Canada or China. It's still going to impact the international climate. My question then as a journalist is, okay, so is what you're saying, is your party's stance that where do you stand on driving down Canadian emissions? Is that the wrong focus? Would you stick with the kind of Paris targets and whatnot that we've seen? Mr. Scheer declined to answer that question, despite the fact that I asked him a couple of times. He says that's something you're going to have to keep an eye out for in the party platform. So it will be interesting to see where Conservatives land specifically on this issue, because they're so bullish, they're so keen on increasing resource exports, be it liquefied natural gas or oil to other countries. Interesting to see how they plan to make that work in terms of the climate part of the equation.
Right. And we're getting more questions here from YouTube specifically. Connor, he's on YouTube, he's asking, do you think there is a risk of a national unity crisis by way of Alberta should the Conservatives not win the election? And I know you were talking about that on your podcast this morning, so please tell us more.
Yeah, so in fact, we've talked about it a couple different places. So let's start with Preston Manning. This is the guy who was the leader of the Reform Party, sort of a populist Western movement that came to power. He was the leader of the official opposition from 1997 to 2000, right? He's this strong voice for folks in the West. Recently, he wrote something in the Globe and Mail that said, hey, if rest of Canada, and he said to me, I really want people in central Canada, I want people in Atlantic Canada to hear this. Rest of Canada, if you vote the Liberals in again, people in this is his point of view. People in the West will be so frustrated with Liberal policies around resources, around oil and energy, that there will be a real push, and the West could leave the country. Now, some of the challenges to what Mr. Manning is saying is that the support, first of all, talking about the West is kind of a complicated thing. There's certainly folks in downtown Vancouver who would say, I'm sorry, are you talking about me? I don't hear myself in this. The support is strongest in Alberta. There is certainly not insignificant support in Saskatchewan. And which parts of BC you're talking about, that is perhaps a bit complex. Mr. Manning pointed to a particular poll that he says shows that support is growing. I talked to the folks who did the poll. They say that's not actually what their data shows. So it is not clear to me that even the frustration that does clearly exist within parts of Alberta about some of the Liberal policies around resources, that it would ever get up to a bar where, I'm not talking forever, but in the medium term, that we would see this shoot up to a bar where there would actually be a referendum and a majority of people would be willing to leave the country. That said, I don't know that means that we should entirely dismiss what he's saying out of hand, even if the numbers don't necessarily reflect an imminent problem. What he's talking about, this frustration within the country, this sense that we're not really hearing each other, I do think it's important that we listen to one another and talk about how to try to resolve some of these issues. It's also worth noting that Mark Carney, who likes to make the point that he grew up in Edmonton, he talked a lot today about himself as an Albertan, has said he wants to build more pipelines and he wants to get more Canadian resources to the world. When I asked Mr. Manning about that and whether or not that kind of, perhaps undercut the argument he was making, he said, listen, I don't believe him. I think that he has, been out there certain views about climate change, and I just don't believe it when he says that he's going to go ahead with exporting more Canadian resources to the world. So I think that debate is an interesting one. I don't think we're on the precipice of, finding ourselves in a Quebec-style 1995 referendum here, but I think it is a conversation that we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And we are paying attention to your questions on YouTube, on TikTok, if you want to write to us on there, or you can email us, ask@cbc.ca. We're going to be going live for another 20 more minutes-ish. And Magic Meow Mix on YouTube is asking, I'm a younger voter that feels disconnected from the main parties. I thought about voting for a smaller new party, the Canada Future Party specifically. How often do these smaller parties gain momentum?
I guess it depends on how you define momentum. It's pretty hard to break through, in part because organizing a federal party is a pretty complicated thing, right? I mean, if you really want to be sort of play in the big leagues, you're talking about running 343 candidates across the country. It's really complicated to do things like leaders tours. It's difficult to get media attention. Really, all of the people involved in setting up a big professional organization, that is a complex thing. But it makes me think, Ashley, I started my reporting career primarily in Montreal, and in 2012, I covered François Legault, his first campaign as the leader, admittedly a provincial party, of something called the CAQ, in Quebec they call it la CAQ, the Coalition Avenir Québec. And at the time, it was honestly kind of a ragtag situation. And François Legault said, listen, I'm going to give this 10 years. And he is the premier of Quebec right now. Again, provincial situation, not federal. I'd say those instances are the exception when you're able to start up something new and really make it happen on a federal level. But it does happen. And I think generally in a democracy, we should applaud people who are looking into the issues and trying to figure out which place politically is the best fit for them.
Absolutely. And we are getting lots of questions, about tariffs and ties and the economy. So I'm going to go to Florian Jana on YouTube, who is asking, hello, he says hello they say hello from Germany. Can we expect strengthened economic ties with Europe, considering the volatility with the US-Canadian relations? Have the candidates made any statements concerning this?
Yes. Long story short, yeah, there's a lot of enthusiasm for that. For me, the question is when the rhetoric matches the reality. So I covered Mark Carney's first trip as Prime Minister over to Paris and London to talk with the President of France, the Prime Minister of the UK, and part of that was about strengthening ties. Pierre Poilievre really enthusiastic about more trade when it comes to energy overseas, things like getting liquefied natural gas and whatnot to European markets, despite some of the geographic challenges. So long story short, yes, there is a lot of enthusiasm to build these relationships and to make Canada less dependent on the United States. The challenge is it's not flipping a switch, right? I mean, when you talk about natural resources, for instance, the market has to support it because these projects are expensive to build. It's difficult to move things overseas, so you need years at times to get some of these projects built. On top of that, and this is where a lot of the political discussion has been, there's this question of how long it takes to just get the projects approved. And in fact, both the Liberals and the Conservatives are saying that process needs to be dramatically sped up. So that's energy, and perhaps it's its own beast because it needs this kind of infrastructure. But these trade relationships don't happen overnight. If you're a Canadian small business and you've been selling something to the United States and you want to sell it to Europe, you've got to figure out who your buyers are. You've got to figure out how you're going to get it there. There may be sort of red tape paperwork that complicates you trying to actually sell your goods overseas. Certainly there is a lot of enthusiasm for trying to support businesses expanding their reach, but the rubber has to hit the road and this stuff has to actually happen. So I think that's going to be an important thing to watch. It's not something we can, I think, meaningfully we can't see how it's going to go during an election campaign. You can listen to the parties, you can judge for yourself who is speaking with the greatest enthusiasm or who has the best plan when it comes to trying to do some of these things, but the proof is really going to be in the pudding.
Absolutely. Yeah. A few more people asking similar types of questions here. Matt Pepper on YouTube asking, past elections have had a large focus on social issues. Do you think this has been set aside for larger issues with the economy and US relations, or will these issues be discussed at the end of the campaign? Are we going to see that later on in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I agree that the principal focus has been on economic issues in Canada-US relations. It's not that there's been no discussion of social issues, and I suppose it also depends on your interpretation of social issues. I'm thinking of policies like dental care, pharmacare, childcare. We have heard from the major party leaders in terms of their intentions about that. The NDP wants to expand pharmacare so it deals with more critical drugs. The Liberals have said, well, we're not gonna cut anything because folks will know. In fact, there's only one pharmacare agreement signed with any of the provinces right now. It's with BC, and the intention of this program right now is to cover medication for diabetics and birth control. So the Liberals have said, listen, we will leave that intact. And the Conservatives, too, have said they're not going to take anybody's benefits away when it comes to things like dental and pharmacare. Now, I think there are a lot of questions, again, about the execution. If you say no child is going to lose their space in a $10 a day childcare program, well, kids age out of those things pretty quickly. With the Conservatives in particular, they've noted that perhaps it's not a flexible enough program. It doesn't necessarily work for everyone. So there's a world where that baton gets handed back to the provinces, and then it's kind of on each individual province whether or not they decide to keep things as they are. The federal party wouldn't necessarily bear responsibility. They would argue for the choices made because they're ultimately made by the provinces. But there's some complexity in there. I would also say, April 16th is the French language debate. April 17th is the English language debate. If you are interested in a wide swath of issues, it's worth your time to try to tune in, or to try to tune into the section you think is of interest to you, because normally those debates, they're going to touch on big things like Donald Trump and internal trade barriers, which I'm blown away that suddenly people on the street want to talk about interprovincial trade barriers. I think it's kind of wild that that's where this Canadian interest is taking us. But it will touch on, I don't know what the topics are, but likely immigration, healthcare, things that we haven't necessarily been hearing a ton about on a day-to-day basis. And again, Ashley, as you said, CBC's platform tracker, great way to see what's been said. Sometimes this stuff comes up, one question at the end of a party's news conference. It can be really consequential, but not everything makes a headline on any given day. But if it's an issue you care about, the information is out there. It's worth trying to look for it from trusted sources.
Absolutely. And we are getting some questions about polls, and I'll see if you can answer this one. But if not, we have some resources for it. So Clark Swim on TikTok asks, what are polls in Quebec showing in terms of Liberal versus Bloc support?
Yeah, so by and large, the Bloc support has hit a bit of a stumbling block. Sorry. Things are not going so well for the Bloc in Quebec. And my understanding from talking to folks on the ground there is that because Donald Trump, again, has been so dominant, and we should add, like, this is the Conservative Party's problem, too. The Conservative numbers are actually not all that bad federally. They have formed government with federal levels of support like this. Their problem is that the NDP and the Bloc are cratering, and those parties, their support is flipping over to the Liberals. And then when you're in an individual race, it's pretty hard to overcome that. So the Bloc support is dropping. Analysts that I have spoken to in Quebec say a big part of it is that Canadians are asking themselves, which government is best prepared to deal with Donald Trump? That for Quebecers, they're saying, we want a strong mandate, a strong government. The Bloc Québécois is not ever going to form government, right? They're a provincial party. It's just not in the cards for them. And so while it may not be like a sudden strong dislike of the Bloc Québécois or their leader Yves-François Blanchet, the party is having difficulty breaking through in this moment. And you're seeing a similar phenomenon, I would add, nationwide on a much bigger scale with the NDP, who is very much trying to get in the conversation and show their relevance. If you look at something like the CBC's poll tracker, I haven't looked today, but they've been anywhere from like 3 to 5 seats based on these seat projections. I don't think it's necessarily going to go quite that badly for the NDP on a federal level. They have strong candidates in specific ridings that will have a lot of people out knocking doors, trying to get the vote out, that may help them in specific individual areas. It's possible they could lose official party status, and that would be a pretty devastating thing. That's 12 seats. If they fall below 12 seats, then they don't have, there's all kinds of resources they lose access to. It would be a real big blow for the NDP. But again, remains to be seen. As I said earlier, someone telling me today that the Conservatives thought they were primed to form government this time in the last campaign. So we'll see.
Yes, it's moving very quickly. And if you do want to keep up with the latest polling, you can head to cbc.ca/poll tracker. That's where we aggregate all of the different polls. So we also have a few questions from TikTok asking about where the parties stand on relief for disabled Canadians and UBI. And we've also got tons of emails just anecdotally to us about this as well, Catherine. So I'm just curious if you know any more about that.
Yeah, I can talk about a couple of these things. I mean, the Liberals did put in place the Canada Disability Benefit, which increased the amount of money that disabled Canadians are supposed to be receiving. I will say they had suggested, or certainly some of the cabinet ministers have suggested, that this was going to be like revolutionary, that they were going to increase the benefits that disabled Canadians were seeing to a point to pull a significant number of people out of poverty. And it's important to take a beat here and say, when you look, I don't have the statistics in front of me, Ashley, but it's galling when you see the number of people in this country who live with a disability and also find themselves living below the poverty line. So the Liberals have been promising like a real sea change here. They've made a difference in the end, but it is not the kind of, sort of flipping the switch, this dramatic shift, pulling hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty that they had initially promised. Whereas there are other parties, under the Green Party in particular, very enthusiastic about this. When it comes to universal basic income, I had been looking at that right before we started this conversation. I would point out that this, I think, again, you're going to want to look at party platforms. It's not the kind of thing you hear the Conservatives talking about. I'm interested, the Liberals haven't brought it up. Interesting to see whether there might be any acknowledgement of that or where they stand on it in their party platform. The NDP put forward what's called a private members bill. So if you're not in government, if you're an MP from another party and you sort of win this lottery, you get a chance to put forward something that you think should become law in the country. And so the NDP's Leah Gazan put forward a private members bill, and what she was proposing, you can't sort of bake money into that if you're not in the government. If you're not in the governing party, you can't say, all right, the government has to spend billions of dollars. So she said, well, I want the finance minister to set up a framework to figure out what universal basic income would look like in this country, figure out how to make this a reality, create the plan. Now that piece of legislation, when Parliament was prorogued, stopped. So it has not moved forward. It dies when Parliament dies. The NDP have, the possibility of bringing this back. They could try to convince the government to adopt it. But one of their MPs was trying to make progress on this issue, and they did not see the progress they were looking for. So again, as the parties, presumably in the next few days, week plus, start putting out these costed platforms where they're telling you not only what they're going to do, but this is important, how are they going to pay for it, right? Are they going to have to cut other things to make a particular promise a reality? Are they willing to go into debt? How do you as a voter feel about the decisions they're making? You want to try to take a look at those, or if that seems too dense, again, at least trusted media sources that are going to tell you a little bit more about how some of these plans might work.
Absolutely. And 10-minute warning here. So if people have more questions, you can write to us in the chat box on YouTube, on TikTok, or you can email us, ask@cbc.ca. We're trying to get as many as we can. We're here with Catherine Cullen, senior reporter at our Parliamentary Bureau in Ottawa. So we do have one question. You were chatting a little bit about the debates earlier. They are happening next week on the 16th and the 17th. So Addison SD on YouTube is asking, what do you think is the most to gain or lose from the debates?
Good question. I think there's a lot of interesting things to watch for. I mean, I guess anytime you're the front runner, which Mark Carney is, you probably have the most to lose because you're dealing with the possibility that you might be the next prime minister. There's a couple interesting things about what's going on with the Liberals, which are very different. On the one hand, Mr. Carney likes to say he's not a politician. He did do debates recently in the Liberal leadership, but this is a whole new ball game on a couple of levels. Doing a debate in French, so he's not so experienced in debates, and that means I think that the expectations for him might be a bit lower. But at the same time, he struggles in French. He's clearly not as comfortable in French as he is in English. Yves-François Blanchet is a francophone, obviously, the leader of the bloc, and Pierre Poilievre speaks excellent and very fluid French. So when you add the challenge of speaking in your second language with people who are really going to be motivated to come at you, that French language debate is going to be really interesting to watch. How does Mark Carney handle himself in an environment that is both sort of challenging in terms of his language, but also where he's really gonna have to handle a lot of blows? On the other hand, the fact that the expectations are low, that he is not necessarily somebody with a lot of experience debating, and someone was telling me in Quebec today, a lot of the people that he talks to say, well, I hear in the media that Mark Carney's French is so bad, and then when I actually hear him, he can actually speak French, and I wasn't expecting that. And so, again, it sort of comes down to expectations. But I think it's all going to be fascinating to watch. Pierre Poilievre, he had the election in his hands just a few months ago, and he is watching some of that slip away right now. He is it's said so many times, but the man is a political fighter. So seeing how he handles himself in that moment is going to be fascinating. 10 days left in the campaign. It's not a lot of time. Really interesting to note, though, the Easter long weekend is right after that. People are going to be meeting with their families. You're going to be talking about it over your Easter ham or your KFC or whatever it is you like to do that weekend. And that's going to be an interesting time of churn. It's also a time people can be doing advanced voting is right around that Easter holiday.
Exactly.
But that's really going to matter, too. So I'm going to Montreal to cover both the French and the English language debates. I cannot wait. If you love politics, it is going to be fascinating.
Yes, and we'll be live streaming all of that on TikTok and on YouTube, Smart. So you can watch it there, and of course on TV. So we have another question that we've got quite a few times, and we've definitely made videos about this, trying to answer this question. Tony Hall on TikTok is asking, will Pierre Poilievre be required to get security clearance if he forms government?
When you are the prime minister, you have access to the information you need to run the country. So it is something of a non-issue for him. Once he becomes prime minister, he de facto has security clearance. Canadians have through the decisions they have made, and there are 343 ridings through the parliamentary system we have, he has been chosen to be the next prime minister of the country. I find the security clearance issue so interesting because I was on a panel and someone said, oh, will this change the way anyone votes? And my gut reaction was it's an interesting issue that speaks to responsibility and leadership, and it might inform people's opinion, but I have a hard time imagining someone going into the ballot box and saying, oh, this is what I'm deciding on. But I heard some coverage from our friends at CBC Radio's The Current. They were out in BC, and they were speaking to a gentleman of the Sikh faith who was saying for him, this is a real issue. He has concerns around foreign interference. He wants to know more about what's going on with Pierre Poilievre, and it really is a driving issue. But it is not a barrier to him becoming Prime Minister in any way, shape, or form.
Definitely. And yeah, again, we've covered this quite a bit on our TikTok channel, on YouTube Shorts, and you can check out that video that kind of does a little Q&A with another Catherine Tunney from CBC.
An excellent Catherine, if I may say.
The issues there. Yes. We are getting to about 4 minutes left here in our Ask Me Anything on the election. I'm here with Catherine Cullen, another wonderful Catherine. We have one more question here from Nasir Hussain on TikTok. He's asking, what happens if Jagmeet Singh loses his seat?
Well, then he's going to have to make a decision about his own political future. And I would suggest that this being his third election, it's going to be really hard for him to stick around. I mean, it can happen, right? A person, Mark Carney was the leader of the Liberals, and he doesn't have a seat in Parliament. Like, it's not that it's impossible from a systems level, but the circumstances matter a lot. I think it's very hard to imagine a world where Mr. Singh stays on if he loses his own seat. There are other people in the New Democratic movement, the New Democratic world, who might have designs on that particular job, and after having 3 kicks at the can, it might be time for Mr. Singh to pursue other things, but we don't know. It's hard to get from like national polls. It's hard to get effective polling on a riding by riding level. There many people sort of do their best to estimate what's going on, and the parties themselves may be doing rather expensive polling on specific ridings. But Mr. Singh insists that things are going to be all right, and we won't find out till Election Day.
Absolutely. I'm going to squeeze in a few more. Shane on YouTube is asking, there's been lots of discussion around building new housing and supporting first-time home buyers, but have either of the Liberals or Conservatives discussed addressing rent affordability specifically?
I mean, this is a multifaceted issue, because some of it involves building new housing stock that can be used as rental. The NDP, I will say, has talked a lot. I know that wasn't in the question, but has talked a lot about renters, perhaps more than the other parties. There are other things that the parties are trying to do to increase the availability of housing, which would, in theory, affect rental affordability. The Liberals in particular were putting money into a program that helped build rental apartments to try to, again, drive up the stock. They are also focused on building what they call non-market housing, so affordable housing, which again helps with the general cost, but it involves creating new spaces. And again, this is the biggest problem, or one of the big problems surrounding the housing crisis, is that all of this stuff takes time. So all of the parties are pitching very multifaceted responses to the housing crisis, trying to come at it from a bunch of different ways. And you're right, there's some very obvious plays to younger people who would like to own a home, knocking off GST for new homes under a certain amount. But for some people right now, that is pretty unimaginable, in part because of the price of housing and just generally the cost of living and affordability issues. So again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the smart thing to do is to take a closer look at what the parties are pitching specifically on housing, be it through our CBC platform tracker, or when they put out their costed platforms, and get a sense of whether you think that speaks to you and your needs right now.
Yeah, and we'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. And okay, we have time for one more question, I think, Catherine. Another user on YouTube is asking, they are from Waterloo, they say hello. Have any of the parties talked about creating more high-skill jobs? Will we need more jobs in technology and medicine? It feels like we have so many smart kids, but no good jobs for them.
That's a really interesting question. What I would say, I'm going to give sort of a partial answer to that question. And again, also hi right back to that person in Waterloo. And again, encourage people to check out the party platforms, because I cannot say that I have an exhaustive memory of everything that's ever been pitched. Mark Carney has a real enthusiasm around the power of artificial intelligence and having it be an important part of Canada's path forward. I could not tell you off the top of my head what he has specifically said about skills around that. Pierre Poilievre, when it comes to jobs in the medical field, is really making a push. And this is something I think it might have been the first thing he announced during the Conservative leadership. So we're talking like 3 years ago now almost, in getting, and I know this doesn't speak directly to the question, but getting skilled immigrants who have credentials in the medical sector into our healthcare system, right? He says that people shouldn't be over here as Uber drivers just because they can't get their accreditation in Canada. So trying to speed that up and get more people into the system. But I think it's a really smart question. And again, I would just encourage people to keep a close eye on what the parties are saying, both what they have said and again, what they're saying in their platforms. Because not every single policy necessarily gets announced with a big flashy announcement over the course of an election campaign. It may be something that you see in the platform once it's put out.
Fantastic. Well, Catherine, thank you so much for answering all of these questions for the past 45 minutes. I know lots more people wanted to ask a lot more, so we really appreciate that time, but we hopefully will have you back to do this again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Ashley, and thanks to everybody who sent in a question. You guys are keeping me on my toes, but I like that, and I hope people stay engaged in this election campaign because, you know, it's a really important time for this country, and the path forward matters, so people should really reflect about where they want things to go and make what they feel is the right choice for the country they want to live in.
Absolutely, and we'll make sure we keep providing all those resources on YouTube, on TikTok. And I'm Ashley Fraser, I'm the CBC News TikTok producer. If you want to send us more of your questions, you can to ask at CBC.ca, and we'll do our best to answer them and get more people like Catherine on these lives. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.